Hello friends, I hope you're doing well. Today I'm going to show you my mastering chain. This is just a simple mastering chain that I use to test out my songs, like in the clubs, when I send it to labels or sending it to friends. I usually don't get a track like officially mastered by my engineer until it actually gets signed, because a lot of labels, they have their own engineer, and so if I get my thing mastered with my guy and then the label's going to use their engineer anyways, then I'm just spending money that I don't have to spend. So I'll show you what this looks like with the plugins that I normally use, and then I'll go over it with just like Ableton stock plugins, and you can like see the difference between those two options. So yeah, let's listen to the track. This is off my label Groove Estate Records. It's coming out in like 2 weeks. I'll put some links in the description below. So yeah, let's have a listen. Alright, so here we are in Ableton. Let's just have a quick listen to the track. So this is without the chain, and this is with it. Alright, so the first step in the mastering process is this high pass filter, just cutting out these low frequencies. So I'm using FabFilter Pro Q2, have this 24 dB per octave filter at 25. So where you set this filter, the crossover frequency, that's going to be determined by the genre of music you're making and the key of your track. So in this particular song, I didn't have any bass notes that went this low, so I figured I could cut everything below that. Now, you're not really going to notice a difference, maybe a slight difference you'll notice, but on your bedroom or home monitoring setup, but in the club, it's going to make a much greater difference. When you're playing on that big system, your bass is going to sound a little bit cleaner, and you're going to get some more headroom out of your mix. So one thing to keep in mind, something really important, is what type of filter are you using. So in this case, I'm using a linear phase EQ. That's why I'm putting FabFilter in. By default, it's on 0 latency, but when you're mastering, you want to have it on linear phase. So the way a normal EQ works is that when you're boosting or cutting, it essentially shifts the phase of those frequencies in order to cancel out or constructively interfere and boost those frequencies. Now when you're doing stuff like messing with the phase, you can easily destroy your sound, especially when you're putting it on the master bus, because you can lose transient response, you might have audible phasing effects. And so on your mastering chain, you should definitely use a linear phase filter. And so with linear phase, it just essentially keeps the phase characteristics intact. Now the downside is that it uses up a lot of CPU power. So that's why it's not really practical to use a linear phase EQ on just like for all your EQs, but definitely on your mastering chain. And another alternative, if you don't have FabFilter, is the Waves Lin band. I'll just show you that right now. Actually, they have Lin EQ, linear EQ, low band. So low band is essentially for the low frequencies. So if I drag that on here, you can see what this looks like, and you can just kind of toggle between your crossover frequency and the Q value. But FabFilter's you have a lot more flexibility on where you set the crossover and all that, so I like using that. So next we have OTT. This is actually a free plugin by Steve Duda over at Xfer. And funny enough, this is a emulation of Ableton's OTT preset for their multiband dynamics. I hate using Ableton's multiband compressor. It sucks. So, I mean, it's kind of the same thing here, but it's just a little bit easier to use, and I find the default preset works pretty well when you just have it on a very low mix depth. So I have mine at 4%. We can just hear what that sounds like. It's a very subtle difference. Without it. With it. You might not even notice with the YouTube compression and all that, but it to me it just it glues the track a little bit together, slightly accentuates the highs and the lows. And like I said, it's very subtle. When it comes to mastering, you don't want to do anything too drastic, because if you are, that means that it's probably something wrong in your mix, and you should just go ahead and fix that in the mix itself. So yeah, I don't really like to use like a proper multi-band compressor when I master my own tracks, just because, like I said, if I need to, for example, compress the bass more, I can just go into my low frequency bus and just compress it within the bus itself, or compress the kick, or whatever need be. So yeah, that's just my thoughts. But if I'm mastering someone else's track, then yeah, I do sometimes use multi-band compressors. So the next part is just SSL EQ, just to add a little shelf. So I'm having 2 dB at 8K. And I mean, I always do this just because it adds a lot of like sparkle and high-end texture. You know, it's like you can almost taste the high frequencies. So I'll toggle that on and off. Again, very subtle difference. Yeah, I'm a huge fan of this SSL EQ just for that high shelf. I think I'm doing it here too in the drums. Yep, see, doing it here as well. Yeah, I just really like the sound that it adds. It's very transparent, clean sounding filter. And lastly, we come to the limiters. So I have 2 instances of FabFilter Pro L, so I'll talk about that in a sec. So the first instance of FabFilter, so going back, so when it comes to limiters, you know, people have preferences. Like some people use Waves L1, some people like Isotopes limiter. I personally like FabFilters. I think it's very, you know, just easy to use, sounds very transparent and clean to me. And so with this first instance of the limiter, I'm using just for gain staging, just to bring it up to 0. So I'm adding, you know, 9 dB of gain here, just bring it up to 0, getting the loudness that I want. I have about 2 dB, sometimes up to 4 dB of limiting going on. I can maybe even bring that down just a tad. Yeah, I mean, nothing crazy here. It's literally just gain staging. But I have another limiter that has no gain staging on, but it essentially has this inner sample peaking turned on. So what inner sample peaking is just, so we work in obviously the digital audio realm. And in digital world, we're working in sample rates, so usually either 44 kilohertz or 44.1 kilohertz or 48 kilohertz. And so our audio is chopped up into these little samples. Now, a normal limiter is going to take those samples and prevent any of them from exceeding 0 dB or whatever you set your limiter to. But the thing that can happen is in between those samples, you can get a peak that's above 0. And so that's where inner sample peaking comes into play, and you can eliminate those inner sample peaks. So the reason I have this on a separate limiter is just because your limiter is going to work well. Like this first limiter is going to work its best when inner sample peaking is turned off, right? So I have this 4 dB of limiting going on here. If I had inner sample peaking turned on, then it's going to be a little bit more distorted. The limiter is essentially going to work harder to achieve the same effect. So it's best just to split this out into 2 separate limiters, one doing gain staging, one taking care of inner sample peaking. And on the second limiter, I'm also just decreasing the output gain by by 1 dB just to make it compatible for streaming services, because streaming services like to have their the top end of their SPL at -1. So yep, and then lastly we just have this loudness meter. This is not actually doing anything to the signal, it's just reading how loud the signal is, and it's doing that in LUFS. So LUFS is just a great way to measure loudness. It's more accurate than RMS. So I can see here that I'm actually hitting a little bit over -10 or under -10. So I think I can increase this just a tad, bring that up to 9. So LUFS just takes into consideration the way people hear sound. So, you know, we hear high frequencies and mid frequencies a little bit better than low frequencies, and all this changes depending on what volume you're listening at and all that. So, I mean, go look up, you know, like Fletcher-Munson curves, psychoacoustics, all that, and you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about if you don't already. So LUFS is just the standard that all the streaming services use. So if you are above their sort of limit, then they're going to turn you down. So Spotify, I believe, is -14 LUFS. Apple Music's, I think, -17, maybe it's -19, can't remember. But essentially, they'll turn you down if you're above this. So obviously, I'm at -10, so I'm going to be turned down. But, you know, -14 is pretty quiet, especially for a dance master. So, I mean, yeah, you're going to be turned down a little bit, but you don't want to be those guys at like -7, because then you're going to be crushing the dynamics of your track, and you're going to be turned down. So it's a lose-lose for you. So I like to keep mine, I don't like to go under -10. So that's just kind of rule of thumb. Oh yeah, and by the way, so this whole mastering thing, this or limiting thing with 2 limiters, learned this from my mastering engineer Matt Davis over at Hacienda Mastering. Shout out to him. Go check him out for some amazing mastering and acoustic services. And also this whole like -10 standard that I just said, that's also from him. It's something that he goes by, and I think it makes sense. After that, you really start to hear the distortion, and sort of you really feel the dynamics being lost in your track. So yeah, I think that's a pretty good rule of thumb. -9 is like pushing it for me. Okay, so that's how you do this using non-stock Ableton plugins. So let me show you what this would look like if I just use Ableton plugins. So obviously I'm gonna have this low pass filter. Let's set it again to 25 Hertz. So in Ableton, this is not a linear phase EQ, but you can put this thing called oversampling on. If you just right click, you can do oversampling. And now I'm not sure if this is exactly like a linear phase mode, but it certainly keeps the phase characteristics more intact than if you had oversampling turned off. And I mainly notice this when dealing with all these high frequencies, which makes sense because right, if you're at 20 Hertz, you're kind of hitting the limit of that sort of Nyquist frequency. If you're at, say, if your sampling rate is at 44.1, so yeah, you could really hear this with the highs, but I might as well have it turned on even when just doing a high pass filter at 25 Hertz. It couldn't hurt. Now for OTT, the replacement obviously could possibly just be OTT, but just the Ableton version. But like I said, I don't like using it, so I'm gonna use drum bus instead. Again, just something to kind of glue the track together. So just set the drive pretty low, don't damp anything, and then let's just kind of hear it. Little 7% drum bus. Again, very subtle effect. So SSL replacement EQ, again, just kind of use Ableton, oversampling on, set this to 8 kilohertz, and set this to 2 dB. Just add that sparkle. And of course we're just gonna use Ableton limiter. Unfortunately, Ableton doesn't have intersample peaking as an option, so we're just gonna have to use one limiter without intersample peaking. That's just a compromise. So let's just do an A/B comparison between the two things. So I can A/B this just by hitting key and click this. I'll just set this to a key on my keyboard. Set this chain as well Turn this off, and now if I hit the key, I can toggle between these two mastering chains. So let's have a listen. So this is the non-stock Ableton chain. So here's the Ableton. So the difference isn't much, but what I'm hearing is just the lows are a little bit more muddy in the Ableton mastering chain. And that could be for a number of reasons. Could be because this EQ might not be linear phase and might be affecting these low frequencies with the high pass. Or it could be because of drum bus. I'm not exactly sure. Again, this isn't something I would actually use. I would always use my good mastering chain. But it's just something to keep in mind if you are using stock plugins, is that for mastering, there are better alternatives out there. When it comes to mixing, I use pretty much only, I use a majority of Ableton plugins, all the EQs, drum bus, compressors, and all that. But mastering is kind of a different ball game. But yeah, that's my mastering chain. Hope you enjoyed that. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe. It takes like 2 seconds. And yeah, catch you in the next video. Peace out, guys, and stay safe from coronavirus. See ya.